Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the SALISES Virtual Forum, Post-COVID Recovery and Economic Imperatives for Growth and Sustainable Development in Trinidad and Tobago. My name is Priya Mohan, and I will be your chair for our session today. Now, the SALISES is physically located on our three campuses. We are first and foremost a research institute where we aim to undertake research that is multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and policy-oriented to problems that face Caribbean small island developing states and the global research agenda more widely. Also, one of our mandates is to discuss issues that the public will feel that is important, and this is what brings us together today for this event. I would now invite Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, our director at SALISES St. Augustine, to give some opening remarks.
Good morning to everyone. Good morning to all in the virtual audience, wherever you are in this world. And thank you very much to Dr. Mohan, who has graciously agreed to chair these proceedings today. It gives me great pleasure to welcome each and every one of you to yet another installment of the SALISES Virtual Forum. This is the seventh of a series of forums we have hosted since October 1st, 2021. And we are really pleased with our event and the impact it has been having in terms of addressing a number of critical issues akin to development process, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but indeed the wider Caribbean. While the event is hosted by SALISES St. Augustine, and when I say SALISES, I'm referring to the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies. While it is the St. Augustine branch of SALISES that is hosting these events, we pride ourselves as a regional think tank because SALISES consists of other organs located on the Mona campus in Jamaica and on the Keyville campus in St. Augustine in Barbados. So we really see ourselves operating under the aegis of SALISES Regional. And it is our effort to really reach out and deliver as best as we can. And we do a good job in doing that as best as we can with respect to issues akin to sustainable development in Caribbean societies. We are a multidisciplinary organ, and I say this because if you reflect upon the forums that we have hosted thus far, you can see we have touched specifically on issues of sustainable development in an interdisciplinary context when you look at the very first and inaugural forum that we hosted. Since then, we have looked at issues around education, again, from a multi and interdisciplinary lens. And then we went on to focus on migration, international migration. We had a session on cultural studies. We did two looking at statistics and information systems and their contribution to national development. And we felt because we are a multidisciplinary organ emphasizing interdisciplinary pursuits that we should look at issues pertaining to economic development, and hence the forum that we are hosting today, looking at post-COVID-19 recovery and economic strategies that would facilitate sustainable development in Trinidad and Tobago, growth of the economy and sustainable development in Trinidad and Tobago. And we think this is important because notwithstanding the fact that there are elements of the pandemic still raging among us, it is clearly the case that countries have to forge ahead. And I think what has happened is that COVID-19 in particular has precipitated initiatives and interventions and efforts that we should have been embarking upon long before COVID-19 struck. in the early 2020s. So it's business as usual, but business as usual in the context of the warnings that were precipitated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, we may have to do things, we will have to do things somewhat differently and somewhat expeditiously to kickstart our economies in order to facilitate the kind of economic growth that we wish to pursue. And in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, of course, when we think of that kind of process, of course, the energy sector, trade, fiscal policy, issues pertaining to managing the Tobago economy, which has its own special requirements in a national context. Of course, issues of money and banking and new monetary instruments. I think all of these are concerns that we have to bring on board, and of course, bearing in mind others. And these issues will be discussed by our distinguished panelists, 6 of them, who we have assembled and who will really deliver the goods and present you with a treat that you will certainly appreciate. So I want to at least make reference to my dear colleague from the late 70s into the 1980s, Mr. Michael John, who is an energy economist and an expert in his field, having many years of professional input into the energy sector in Trinidad and Tobago. And he also teaches in the Department of Economics. So I know we are in good hands when Mr. Michael John would certainly share his insights as they relate to the energy sector and the future of Trinidad and Tobago in the post-COVID recovery era. I also want to signal my 2 colleagues, long-standing colleagues, both on the football field and certainly in our own professional endeavors. We are fierce crusaders in our own specific disciplines and sub-disciplines, pursuing the academic work we do in the interest of development in the region. And I speak of Dr. Shridath, Dr. Dave Shridath, and Dr. Lester Henry, who are both speakers in this session here today. And I really look forward to their presentations, given their length of service and their length and depth of inquiry into the issues that they will be speaking of and that are so dear to them in terms of their professional and intellectual pursuits and journey. I want to also make reference to Dr. Vanus James, whom I met back in the 1990s when I returned from Canada to serve the region. And Dr. James is a well-respected international consultant. He is dubbed in many ways a scholar of the works of Sir Arthur Lewis. And Dr. James has made profound contributions in terms of issues akin to economic development in so many spheres and subdisciplines within the domain of economics. And we are really happy that he has agreed to grace us with his presence and illuminate our session with his knowledge. And then, of course, Dr. Michelle Salandi, whom I met when she was a student in the Department of Economics, and I was always impressed with her intellect, and I have seen her blossom and grown into an economist of worth, already making profound contributions in her domain and sphere of interest. And I am very happy and indeed pleased that Dr. Salandi has agreed to grace us with her presence. And last but not least, Ms. Alicia Nicholls, who hails from our sister CARICOM state, Barbados, who is a trade expert and operates within the confines of the Sir Shridath Ramphal Center on the Cave Hill campus in Barbados. She is a renowned expert in trade matters in the region and has done a tremendous amount of work on issues pertaining to trade policy. And we are really indeed and happy to welcome her. And we do consider her, among others, as a friend of SALISES. So having said that, you are in for a treat and we are happy to have you on board. And I do hope that you enjoy the proceedings and that you can continue to participate in our events as long as we continue to have these events. So without much more to say, I want to pass you back on to the chairperson. And as I said before, do enjoy our treat today. Have a good day, all of you.
Thank you, Dr. St. Bernard, for those opening remarks. You've really placed the topic of the post-COVID recovery and economic imperatives for growth and sustainable development into context and why it's important for us to discuss this issue today. You've also given a brief introduction into our speakers. I just want to remind everyone that Dr. St. Bernard has really been the champion behind this initiative, and we are very happy that he continues to engage in such topical issues. So as I said, my job today is that of the chair. So I would go through some rules of engagement as we go along today's proceedings. We do have 6 presentations. Each presenter would be given 10 minutes to speak on their topic. I would introduce each presenter and their topic, followed by their presentation. After all 6 presentations, we'll then have a question and answer segment for 30 minutes. The audience can type in their questions in the chat. Please feel free to type your questions even while persons are presenting, and I shall take note of those questions to then ask those questions in the question and segment answer. So without further ado, let's go to our first presenter. So our first presentation today would be Mr. Michael John. His presentation would be the future of the oil and gas as pillars of economic growth. Mr. Michael John has been a lecturer at the Petroleum Studies Unit in the Chemical Engineering Department at the St. Augustine campus of the UWI. He teaches in the MSc Petroleum Engineering and Management program in the course Petroleum Economics, Law, and Contract Administration. Mr. John also previously lectured in the Economics Department at UWI St. Augustine. Mr. John has multiple interests, including energy, economics, and policy, education and youth and development. So I hand you all over now to Mr. John to make his presentation.
Morning, everyone, and thank you, Chair, for your introduction. Thank you, Dr. St. Bernard, for your kind remarks. It is a privilege to be here, and I want to say thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to participate in this forum. I want to commence with some lines from Rudyard Kipling, and it goes like this. This is our lot if we live so long and labor to the end. Then we outlive the impatient years and the much too patient friend. And because we know we have breath in our mouth, we think we have thoughts enough in our head. We shall assume that we are alive, whereas we are really dead. We shall not acknowledge that old stars fade and stronger planets rise, that the sere bush buds and the desert blooms, and the ancient wellhead dries, or any new compass wherewith new men adventure neath new skies. We shall lift up the ropes that constrain our youth and bind our children's hands. We shall call to the waters below the bridge to return and replenish our lands. We shall harness death's pale horses and scholarly plow through the sands. We shall lie down in the eye of the sun for lack of light on our way. We shall rise up when the day is done and chirrup, behold, it is day. We shall abide till the battle is won ere we amble into the fray. We shall peck out and discuss and dissect and evert and extrude to our mind the flaccid tissues of long dead issues offensive to God and mankind, precisely like vultures over an ox that the army has left behind. We shall make walk preposterous ghosts of the glories we once created, immodestly smearing from model palettes amazing pigments mismated. And our friends will weep when we ask them with boast if our natural force be abated. The lamp of our youth will be utterly out, but we shall subsist on the smell of it. And whatever we do, we shall fold our hands and suck our gums and think well of it. Yes, we shall be perfectly pleased with our work, and that's the perfectest hell of it. This is a lot. If we live so long and listen to those who love us, that we are shunned by the people about and shamed by the powers above us. Wherefore, be free of your harness betimes. But being free, be assured that he who had not endured to the death from his birth had never endured. This is the poem, The Old Men, and you may wonder, why would I open with something like this? Why would I begin with something that is as strange as this? And what relation does that have with the whole question of the future of oil and gas as pillars of economic development? I hope you recognize the theme of aging, which is what it is about. But secondly, there's the issue of change resistance and the whole question of paradigms that are stuck in time. And so we are dealing with a problem which is the challenge of the role of the energy sector in the economy, which existed long before COVID, but which points us to the fact that our discourse cannot be pure economics, because we are dealing with a wicked problem and we cannot continue to apply a 20th century prescription to a 21st century challenge. But resistance to change is ingrained in our discourse, especially with regards to the role of energy or the role of oil and gas in the economy. So let's map out what we're talking about. So when I refer to the future, I'm talking about the likely prospects for fate of someone or something in time to come. I refer to pillars when I'm talking about a person or thing providing essential support for something else. And I'll take the easy way out with economic growth by looking at persistent increase in per capita aggregate output and the aggregate physical capital per worker in the economy. If I am to put all my remarks into a nutshell, I would say that the future of oil and gas as a pillar of economic growth is tied to, one, the future of the international petroleum industry, and secondly, the resilience and longevity of the domestic industry. The industry operates with what we can call tailwinds and headwinds. The tailwinds would provide the opportunity for the industry to contribute. The headwinds will challenge it. So we are looking today at a tight supply situation, exacerbated by geopolitics, which represent opportunities for earning. So the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia have created opportunities for energy and for oil and gas in our region to capitalize on prices, higher prices. But we also note that there is supply realignment coming, and that alignment will possibly open the scope for additional African gas into Europe to replace Russian supplies. And then there's competition. Competition coming from two directions. The producer's strategy and ramping up exploration to capitalize on markets prior to the projected demise of oil when it's replaced in the energy transition by renewables. And secondly, the whole question of the penetration of renewables. And this would mean that the role of oil has to change going forward. Our paradigm with regards to oil and gas as a pillar in our economy is that we have a paradigm that speaks to looking at the economy from the perspective of the oil and gas sector versus the non-oil sector, with government as the driver. And the pillar for us means that we look to it for government revenue, we look to it for balance of payment surpluses, we look to it for Forex, and we look to it as making a dominant and significant contribution to GDP. But if we look at the data, and I'm here looking at the CSO's quarterly economic data on GDP and looking at the contribution over time, and I pulled a few years in a timeline to realize that with the exception of the petrochemical sector, all areas of the oil and gas sector has been making a declining contribution to GDP over time. So whether or not we like it, the period of depletion of decline is approaching. So that the sector moved from contributing 42% of GDP in 2012 to 33.8% in the first quarter of 2021. And by the third quarter of 2021, that was down to 30%. Oil and condensates, exploration and extraction moved from 11.3 to 8.9% in terms of its contribution. And all the rest of the activities, especially refining, has now moved down to 3.3%. And I should point out that what passes for refining under the GDP information really refers to what goes on in LNG and NGLs, natural gas liquids. So that is writing on the wall. In fact, when you look at the quarterly GDP numbers, and I look at it for, let's take quarter 3 of 2021, you'd find that the larger contributors to GDP in terms of the sectors would be mining and quarrying, which would include oil and gas exploration, manufacturing, 18.2%, mining and quarrying, 15.9%, and trade and repairs, which seems to be a growing sector, 21.3%. What am I saying? I'm saying that as far as the domestic industry is concerned, we have to ask questions about its resilience, how efficient it is, how cost effective it is. And we have to ask questions as well about longevity. How fast are we adding reserves? How fast is production declining? How fast are we identifying exploration projects or prospects, and our ability to attract investment? The sector has been reorganized, and we now have the Trinidad Petroleum Holdings organizing the state side of it. But if you notice carefully that from the petroleum side of it, the company that is moving into where the future challenges seem to be coming from is the NGC, and not any of the companies in the state oil side or this oil side of the state's business. But that is not all. We also have to deal with the question of the longer term issues, energy transition and climate mitigation. And these are going to be major issues emerging. Don't believe for one moment that the movement, the anti-fossil fuel movement, will go away. And I want to suggest that it will emerge with force as soon as the energy security situation in Europe is settled. It may take a year, it may take a bit more, but then we'll return to that situation. Now, if you look at the first report of the task force that was appointed to look at recovery and to look at what it proposed for the energy side of the business, from the oil and gas point of view, it was really, to my mind, aimed at maintenance, maintaining a schedule of projects onshore and offshore, supporting energy sector services. And then it mentioned the pursuit and development of the hydrogen economy and green petrochemicals. But this is an area that requires a lot more thought. And so we need to think in terms of where we are going with this. But put that against a changing customer reality. We are looking at a time when the deinstitutionalization of energy is approaching on us. And it raises questions about, should we continue with the amount of centralized energy that we have grown accustomed to?
Mr. John, if I could just interrupt, can you wrap up in about 2 minutes, please?
Sure, no problem. So the role of oil with regards to the future of this economy. The question is, can oil reemerge? Can gas output be maintained and at what price? What are the likely impacts of transition away from oil and gas, which is coming on the economy? Can job creation from renewables offset losses which would occur with the cutback in fossil fuel use? What kind of jobs are we going to generate? Manufacturing, repair, or replacement? Where will the forex come from? And how will potential state revenues be replaced? I, from my perspective, do not expect a pillar role for oil in the future. I see it as contributing, but not driving the economy. LNG and gas may continue to do that for the time being. But oil production in Trinidad and Tobago, for that, the possibility exists that our output may be exhausted long before the market disappears. This means that the role in the future has to be the role of energy and energy focus, which is broader than just oil and gas. And this energy focus will require a structured framework, a structured approach. Now, I started with the question of the poem, The Old Men, and I underscore the need for us to begin to explore the things which are seeming blasphemous from my perspective, from people like me who have been involved in the industry. There is a role for oil and gas in the future, but may I say it may not be what we have grown accustomed to or what we seem to be continuing to want to expect. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. John. We'll now be moving along to Ms. Alicia Nicholls, and her presentation is entitled Trade Policy for National Growth and Sustainable Development. Ms. Nicholls is a junior research fellow at the Shridath Ramphal Center for International Trade, Law, Policy and Services at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. She's also currently enrolled in the MPhil PhD program in political science at the UWI Cave Hill. Her research and teaching interests include global financial regulation, contemporary Caribbean trade policy issues, investment policy, and law and financing for sustainable development. Alicia, please proceed to your presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, and good morning to everyone. Greetings from beautiful Barbados. First, let me thank SALISES St. Augustine and Director Dr. St. Bernard for the kind opportunity to participate in this 8th SALISES virtual forum. I applaud the excellent outreach work and scholarship, especially on the COVID moment and what this means for the region's development imperatives. And my presentation today looks at trade policy for national growth and sustainable development against the forum theme, post-COVID recovery and economic imperatives for growth and sustainable development. Now, it prompted me to look back at one of my favorite speeches from the late Professor, the Right Excellent ONC MacArthur. I'm a bit partial to him because he used to come into our office in the SRC and talk trade with us and development issues and anything else that was on his mind. And as for me, a young scholar, that really was something that was motivating. And in his speech entitled Small States in Stormy Weather, delivered in Guyana on February 27, 2009, he noted that not for the first time, the Caribbean ship of state was sailing in uncharted waters. And he was speaking of the global financial crisis at the time. But if you read the speech, you will think that he was talking about the turbulent international waters roiled by the storms of COVID-19, the Russian-Ukraine crisis, the supply chain shortages, and all the other things which have become part of this new normal that we seem to be trying to cope with. And he stated as follows: the response of the Caribbean to the enormous challenge with which it is confronted as a result of the dangerous instability in the global economy will very much determine whether that outcome becomes the region's destiny. Now, what does all of this have to do with trade policy? Trade policy is one of several navigational instruments on which ships of state rely to navigate towards the terra firma of national growth and sustainable development. And of course, by sustainable development, we mean development which meets the needs, current needs, without compromising the needs of future generations. So the trade policy toolkit, as we know, comprises the laws, regulations, practices, and policies that regulate a country's trade with external partners. And trade, as much as the literature shows, can have very positive benefits for growth and development. According to Kadan 2015, trade can have benefits by increasing production, export levels, realize positive benefits through greater levels of employment, reducing poverty, improving competitiveness, and benefiting from the transfer of technology. But I think we all know, and I know I'm not speaking to an unconverted audience, we know that these things are not automatic. And the same way that a faulty ship navigational system can imperil the ship and run it onto a reef of bad fiscal policy, etc., so can a faulty trade policy do the same for the Caribbean ship of state, especially in these rough seas. So in this presentation today, I'll speak a bit about a trade policy fit for helping the Caribbean ship of state navigate these rough seas. Now, we are all aware the Caribbean is not a luxury liner or a yacht, but a collection of small boats. I won't go so far as say we're dinghies, but we're small. And we're trying to reorient and expand our trading relations with existing and newer trading partners in a post-preferences world, while also seeking to form a seamless fleet through the CARICOM single market and economy that will afford us the best opportunity to survive the vagaries of this changing international political and economic order. And those of you who would have attended Professor Justin Robinson's very good speech at the SALISES conference a few weeks ago, he spoke about the middle income trap and offered ideas for overcoming it. And I know many of us are aware of many of the issues that the Caribbean is facing. You know, we have high levels of debt. In some cases, we have high levels. We're a very open economy, so we're very dependent on trade, particularly imports. We have small population sizes, very narrow economic export bases, susceptibility to shocks, whether natural or financial, etc. We tend to have low rankings on global competitiveness indices globally, limited access to concessional finance. Our real GDP growth on average compared to other regions tends to be not as good. And yes, while we have high levels, generally speaking, of human development, COVID-19 has really exposed and exacerbated some of the pre-existing social issues. So rising crime, large informal economies, youth underemployment and unemployment, rising income inequality. And the question is, how can trade be used to assist with this? Now, in the latter part of my discussion, because I realize I only have less than 5 minutes, I would note that any ship needs a good crew. So this trade policy isn't just for the ship, but also the private sector, because we speak about the state, but it's firms that trade. It's also civil society, academia, the diaspora, all of whom have an important role in getting the Caribbean ship of state to this terra firma of growth and sustainable development. Now, first, in terms of alignment of trade policy with development goals and objectives, we have to ensure that our trade policies are informed by, anchored to, and supportive of the national and regional development goals and objectives as outlined by the countries. So some of our countries like Jamaica and Belize, for instance, have clearly articulated trade policy documents. And in addition, it isn't just to have a document, you must also have policy alignment. So you can't on one hand be saying, okay, we want to reduce NCDs, but then you have high taxes on import duties on gym equipment and healthy foods, those sorts of things. So you want to see how your trade policy could align with and support your development goals. Another thing is that we have to increase private sector utilization of our existing trade agreements and preferential trade arrangements. So a study by Kadan and McLean and Kadan 2014, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, found very low levels of utilization of the region's trade agreements at the time. And this is not one-off because several other studies have also found this in terms of the ex-post evaluation conducted by the European Union on the EPA, found that many firms, not just in the region, but also in the EU, were not aware of the EPA's benefits and were not using them. So there is a need to monitor the effectiveness of our current export promotion programs, which are aimed at addressing the challenges firms face to exporting, such as access to finance, knowledge deficits, etc. And we also have to consider if there are other countries with which we will want to pursue formal arrangements, and perhaps not through traditional FTAs, but through trade and investment framework or cooperation agreements, which are less cumbersome to negotiate and have less legal ramifications. And I know, for instance, with regard to the private sector, our chamber here in Barbados has been very proactive in terms of signing MOUs with chambers and working with those chambers in countries that Barbados is seeking to build new relations with. We have to improve our evaluation of the development impact of our trade and investment agreements. We have to improve ease of doing business. I mean, that's something we talk about all the time, and there are ongoing reforms. And I know some of our countries, a few of, I think 5, are part of the World Trade Organization's investment facilitation for development negotiations, which are aimed at improving our investment climates. But we have to create an enabling environment if we want to address this whole thing of youth underemployment and unemployment. We have to create an enabling environment for our young entrepreneurs to pursue their dreams by improving access to finance, cutting a lot of the red tape, improving access to information, etc. We have to have a workforce that is fit for a 21st century Caribbean, and not just in terms of the hard subjects, but also softer skills. We have to deploy the right people in the right positions in governments, no more square pegs and round holes. We have to improve data access. So it is very frustrating for many of us, we're all researchers here, to find data in some cases for the region in terms of trade and investment, particularly investment. We have to improve the capacity of our statistical offices, because this is data that researchers need, that policymakers need to make evidence-based policy, that our firms need in order to make decisions. Another thing is in terms of innovation and industrial policy, we need to have that marriage, and it has started, but that marriage between our universities and governments and the private sector, that seamless marriage in order to help promote research, which is industry oriented. And, you know, Sir Arthur Lewis talked about industrialization by, I realize my time is up. Talked about, I'll wrap up now, Madam Chair. So Arthur Lewis talked about industrialization by invitation. I will say that what we could do is innovation by invitation, which is what some other countries are doing, these special visa programs to encourage entrepreneurs and investors, etc., from the diaspora around the world to create startups and invest in startups in the Caribbean, which will help create jobs. And lastly, the diaspora. We cannot forget the diaspora as part of our trade strategy. These are the people who buy our goods overseas, but more than that, these are potential investors. These are persons who can help us with the gap. And to conclude, out of crisis comes opportunities. There are opportunities with regard to nearshoring, global value chains, near sourcing, etc. Instead of just focusing on how the crisis is affecting us negatively, we have to start turning lemons into lemonade and seeing how these things could benefit us. So in closing, like many times before, the Caribbean ship of state faces rough and unpredictable global waters. Trade policy anchored in a sound development policy can help to safely guide our ships together as a fleet towards safe harbor on terra firma of national growth and development. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry, Madam Chair, for exceeding my time.
Thank you, Alicia. I just want to remind the audience that you can type your questions in the chat. So far, the feedback coming is that we've had 2 excellent presentations. We've had the first presentation on the energy sector in Trinidad and Tobago, not just from an economic perspective, but from a socioeconomic perspective. Then we just had Alicia, who looked at a trade policy fit for Caribbean small island developing states. So please keep your questions coming and comments. I'll then ask these questions at the end. We next have Dr. Lester Henry next on our program. Dr. Henry, no stranger to us at SALISES. He's a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics at UWI St. Augustine. His research interests include international finance, capital flight, monetary policy, and digital divide and regulatory policy. Dr. Henry will be presenting fiscal challenges and implications for managing post-COVID recovery efforts.
Okay, let me just, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Dr. Henry.
And you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, in terms of the topic here today, I just decided to focus on a couple of things that I think are very important since it's only 10 minutes. And to add my 2 cents in that such a short space of time, I divided my issues into what I call international developments and a couple of domestic challenges as well for the local economy. We can extend the regional issues in the discussion. But the first thing I want to mention, of course, is the revenues from price increases from the international events, also referenced by Michael John in his lead-off presentation. And we have seen that this is something that the country has already benefited from. If you listened to the Minister of Finance earlier this week, in terms of the government revenue, he's already talking about a potential budget surplus for the fiscal year 2021-22, as opposed to deficits, which we have almost been accustomed to over the almost 10 years, right? Or just about, well, probably just more than 10 years now. So those price increases that came about because of this supply chain problems and the obvious events in Ukraine and so on that we are all familiar with have contributed to making us a little bit better off. And that I will link that to the wage negotiations below in a bit. The revenues from these increases, of course, haven't come because all categories of commodities and especially energy-related commodities have tended to show some kind of price increase over the last few months, especially. And I know there are challenges as we should keep in mind, as Mr. John expertly pointed out, but this is on the positive side. that we, if these prices are sustained, if there is a prolonged conflict and so on, we clearly will have the benefit on the positive side of increased fiscal revenue, which we have already seen as presented in the mid-year review earlier this week. Another issue that is very critical to us is the gas deal with Venezuela. Somewhat controversial, but very important for us from a purely economic perspective. Never mind the politics of Guaido and Maduro and what the Americans might have up their sleeves. One thing is for certain is that given the new developments in the international environment, the Americans might be easing some of the sanctions on Venezuela. And there may be a brighter prospect of Venezuelan gas coming into to Trinidad and Tobago, which could be very, very well, which will add a lot to fiscal revenues. And of course, people who know about this stuff understand this a very long time ago, that this deal was a potential game changer in terms of fiscal revenue for the government, regardless of who the government is. And given the Americans basically looking for alternative supplies than the Russian gas and oil, we stand to significantly benefit from a thawing of the relationship between Venezuela and the US. On the downside, I'll quickly mention the impact on the Heritage and Stabilization Funds of the recent fluctuations, I think, in the financial markets hasn't been positive. We have seen declines in our international investments, as many of us who monitor our pension funds that are invested with BlackRock and international investment companies, but well, the UE one is mainly BlackRock, have seen a large drop in our value over the last few months. And if you, depending on how diversified your portfolio was, your hit might have been larger than some others. Okay, so those are the key international developments I would like to flag. Again, two significantly positive, one negative in the sense that the impact on the Heritage and Stabilization hasn't been positive in the recent months. So now the domestic challenges I see prominent in the news, in fact, today, is the rejection of the labor union, the PSA in particular, and other labor unions of the government's initial offer. So there could be trouble brewing there. They're calling it a joke. And it's a 2% over 8 years. And they find that to be quite insulting. But this, of course, ties in with the minister's positive mid-year review earlier in the week, where they created a kind of positive expectation that we had a little bit more money to play with to pay some bills. And of course, the unions and the workers in the public sector who have had a wage increase since 2013, living on 8 years old wages, they obviously created, developed a positive expectation and was expecting something more than the 2% over the 8 years. And that, of course, that will significantly impact government revenues, as depending on where the settlement ends up. And the government is in a sticky position, of course, because I assume they understand that they have to grant wage increases, but they know that the revenue situation, while it is looking good at the moment, the developments could change very rapidly over the next 6 months to a year, depending on how these international issues play themselves out. One other issue I think is significant for the domestic economy here in Trinidad is the pent-up demand from COVID A lot of people have not talked about this, but remember, people were at home for almost 2 years and there was hardly any spending going on, right? And you could see it sometimes if you go out at night and you go to the restaurants and so on, you see a significant amount of people during the week. In the old days, some of, I think Dr. James and some of the people who are in the same bracket like me, right, remember something called Panton's Lyman Index. That was first put forward by our deceased colleague from long ago, Dennis Panton, who said, you can tell how the domestic economy is doing by the amount of people liming during the week, during the middle of the week, not on a Friday, right? And that was a good leading indicator as to how people feel about the economy. So yes, Panton's Lyman Index, I think is appropriate now. And the final point I would raise is the impact of the potential property tax and the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority in terms of fiscal issues. I mean, there are a lot of other issues we could talk about, but these are just some I would flag in this short presentation. Property tax has to happen at some point. And I think the government is pretty much determined that it will happen sometime this year. And the introduction of the Revenue Authority could have a significant impact on the revenue generation of the country. And so now, one final thing I should have mentioned when I talked about the fiscal situation. The minister mentioned a debt GDP ratio of currently of about 72%, which was a significant improvement from his numbers from about 90% when the budget was presented last year, right? And of course, if the revenue increases, persists for the next 3 to 6 months, we could end up with a debt GDP ratio back down to about 60%, where people would not consider us to be falling into a debt trap, as was clearly we were heading to late last year and in the run-up before that. Because the government did borrow a lot of money significantly to keep people employed, to pay public sector workers, and so on, which is something that should not be underestimated. But the borrowings were significant, especially domestic borrowing, not so much international. And that could easily have come back to haunt us, as we all know. So I will just stop there and I'll keep the rest for the questions or discussion time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. Thank you for sticking on time. That was Dr. Henry's presentation on fiscal issues in the post-COVID-19 recovery, and also giving us some positive news with the Panton's Lyman Index. Next up, we'll have our presentation by Dr. Vanish James. Dr. Vanish James is a former senior policy advisor to the UNDP and the World Intellectual Property Organization, where he served as a consultant. The central thesis of his research is that domestic capital is too small. I'm sure we're going to hear some more on that. Dr. James's presentation is entitled Managing Economic Affairs in Tobago. I'm handing you over now to Dr. James.
Thanks, Priya, and welcome to the colleagues and audience in the session. Let me give thanks to Godfrey and all other colleagues at SALISES and thank them for inviting me to participate in this session. Another preliminary comment I want to make here is that the results I'm about to share with you reflect ongoing research for the World Intellectual Property Organization with the use of global data. It's also worth pointing out that if you want to talk about managing development in Tobago, that would almost be synonymous with managing diversification of the national economy, given where the potential lies in the nation as a whole. And it's also worth mentioning that the Tobago I'll be talking about will be the Tobago as defined by the THA Act, not the Tobago as Tobagonians see the space. Now, let's set some context here. Trinidad and Tobago belongs in the subset of what we normally classify from global data as developing economies. It has a GDP per capita. It had that in 2019 of about $16,129 US per person. Per year, sorry, not per person. GDP per capita of 16,129 over the year. And its average capital share of GDP over 2010 to 2019 was 49%, where you define capital as output used to make other things, to produce other goods and services. The level of institutional development for the country was indexed in 2019 at 63.4, which was about 27% below the average of 86.4 for the countries classified as developed. And Trinidad and Tobago's capacity to innovate was indexed at about 28.08, about half of that of the class of countries, the class of developed economies, so to say. Now in Tobago's case, and that's Tobago as defined by the THA Act, the 2019 GDP per capita was 5 times or so smaller than that of the country, at $3,400 US. And the capital share of GDP was well below 40%, which is much more characteristic of much poorer economies than Trinidad and Tobago. Tobago's level of institutional development is extremely low, and its capacity to innovate wouldn't really register on the measurement scale of the Global Innovation Index that I work with. Now, what this comparative GDP per capita data with Tobago and Trinidad and Tobago really demonstrates is that Tobago runs what is essentially a failed economy that is living above its means, supported by transfers from the, what frankly would have to be treated as transfers from the Trinidad economy. And one indication of this is the fact that the THA, Tobago's domiciled government, spends about $2.3 billion a year, while its economy has revenue capacity in the region of $600 million a year, if you set the tax rate at about 30% of output, so to say. Now, when you interpret Tobago's situation in these terms, what you find is that Tobago has a considerable development challenge, a Herculean task. And you have to see that it must systematically improve its GDP per capita over time. Its management processes must lead to systematic improvement of its GDP per capita over time, just to catch up with Trinidad and Tobago. And then, if you really want to talk development, it must then move past the national standard to catch up with the emerging and developing economies, all of which are also improving at the same time. Now, how does Tobago develop in this sense? How do you manage and design your development effort in that sense? And the answer really has to be provided in 2 parts. One part has to do with the competitive strategy that must be adopted, and relative to that, realistic growth targeting. And the second has to do with how you grow productivity with the competitive strategy, so to say. That should point you to the fact that mediating between the competitive strategy and the level of living is productivity and productivity growth. Now, economies compete for development opportunity in global markets all over the world. And when we use counterfactual empirical modeling with of global data, what we find is that 3 integrated strategic factors, competitive factors, cause productivity and the standard of living globally. One is the capital share of GDP, which is what Priya was pointing to when she said that I claim that the capital share of GDP in these Caribbean countries is much too small. And the second is the level of institutional development. And the third is the level of technology, which is tied closely to the capacity to innovate and bring new solutions to problems thrown up by markets, which is what the Global Innovation Index really tries to measure. And the lesson for Tobago in all of that is that to raise its living standards at some desired rate, an appropriate rate to catch up with the country, for example, and on a self-sustaining basis, what Tobago must do is simultaneously devote adequate resources to updating and upgrading its institutions, grow its capacity to innovate, and build capacity to produce and export capital, the basis on which you will develop and diversify trade. Now, these variables, these three critical integrated variables, are linked to the standard of living as measured by GDP per capita, by characteristic elasticities, which we've been able to estimate. The capacity to innovate has an elasticity of 1.9 thereabouts. The capital share has an elasticity of about 2.3, and institutional development has an elasticity of about 1.6. And in trying to catch up with Trinidad and Tobago, what Tobago really has to think about is how to calibrate its investment programs to generate the desired rate of return, investment programs that yield these kinds of changes in integrated strategy that I'm describing there. If you, for example, could improve your capacity to innovate at 1%, your institutional quality at 1%, and your capital share of GDP at, say, 2%, then Tobago could grow its GDP per capita annually by about 8.03%, 8% somewhere in that zone. It would take Tobago 21 years growing at that rate to get to the GDP per capita of the country. It would take 30 years for Tobago to get past that to about 34, somewhere where the average of the emerging and transition economies would be. And it would take about 35 years for Tobago to get up to 50,000 US dollars or so, which is about the average of the developed economies today, as in 2019. Now, one of the great lessons of the great development debate of the 1950s and 60s is that if you're going to drive up, aggregate over economy-wide productivity, you have to do it in a multi-sectoral way. And in the context of Tobago, you have about 3 broad sectors you could identify if you follow the works of people like Arthur Lewis and Lloyd Best and so on. One of them would be these low productivity sectors that, that encourage people to migrate from them, because the workers working in those sectors work with limited or no significant capital. Arthur Lewis said no capital, and incur diminishing returns to labor and widespread underemployment. And if you have sectors like that, then these sectors will have a low internal capacity to save and finance investment for themselves and for the country. So in general, what you find in Tobago's case is that these low productivity sectors are private domestic agriculture, government, THA is very low productive sector, and the distributive trades. And if you want to get out of the situation they are in, the strategy would have to be to increase the amount of capital used by these sectors, used by the agricultural sector, modernization through improved use of capital per worker in the sector, and the application of modern high-tech methods, high-tech agriculture and stuff like that, by the entrepreneurs, by farmers, and even by government institutions. And that could only happen if you have government-sponsored research and skill-intensive training programs, infrastructure development programs, investment incentives, and medium-term innovative financing to promote adoption of the applicable techniques and capital forms that are implied in productivity growth. And critical to the conversation and to the the management processes of a place like Tobago would be to upgrade the institutional arrangements supported by necessary public education, arrangements through which the private sector, the public in general, can influence the design of public policy. The other kind of sector that we have in Tobago, in a very small share of the economy, but it's there, is the traditional kind of export-oriented sector. We have some of that in the old cocoa, export agriculture, and some fisheries and so on. That's what the famous capital of paradise is supposed to be doing. And then we have some raw mineral exports in the andesite exported by the Studley Park Quarry and so on. And for those, what you're going to have to do is increase investment in the amount of capital they employ to upgrade production techniques, upgrade inputs, modernize output, and so on. Some of that capital will have to be imported and some will have to be produced as domestic capital in the form of research and education and skill-intensive training, healthcare, and so on. Then you have to combine the domestic component of that capital optimally with the imported component in order to keep up to speed with piecewise technical change that is going on all the time. When you say you follow the government's policy of flagship policy of digitization, that's primarily an import-driven technical adjustment process, and you have to kind of counter that import orientation with the use of a lot of skill-intensive training, modernized education, upgraded healthcare, and all that sort of stuff. So you get the optimal balance between them. We know where the indexes would point us to identify that optimal balance. And then you have to privatize a lot of these government-owned businesses that we have here in Tobago. The Studley Park Quarry, for example, is a prime target for privatization if you think about it properly. You then need to think about a lot of government-sponsored skill-intensive training and infrastructure development. You have to think about investment incentives to support any technical change dynamic that you want to encourage. You have to arrange improved access to long-term innovative development financing for those targeted sectors. And then the institutional arrangements.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you'll have to start wrapping up.
I will. I am almost at the end. The institutional arrangements will also have to be upgraded. Now, the flagship sector that you have to drive in Tobago is the capital producing sector and exporting sector, education, healthcare, the creative industries, and stuff like that. And they too must benefit from low-cost innovative development bank financing and related incentives to attract foreign investment and all of that. And in these, as well as with the other sectors, you have to facilitate public participation in the policy process. And if you did things in that way, based on the evidence we have, what would happen is that your marginal productive labor would tend to grow relative to the wage. You would tend to be able to internalize your savings process and finance investment on a self-sustaining basis. Taxable capacity would grow, environmental sustainability would grow, and our capacity to innovate and participate in intra-industry trade would also grow. And on that basis, you would manage the Tobago economy to deal with its development challenges as we see them. So Priya, I would stop there and let the issues be settled in the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. James. Thank you for that perspective on Tobago. To our audience in the chat, you would see a link to all our previous events. If you would like to look at those events, you can download that document in the chat and you would have access to those events. Next on the program is Dr. Dave Shridath. Dr. Shridath is an economist studying the Caribbean and emerging economies for over 20 years, particularly in the financial sector. He teaches international money and finance at the graduate level at the Institute of International Relations, UWI St. Augustine. Dr. Shridath's presentation, Domestic and International Financial Market Challenges and Implications for Managing Post-COVID Recovery Efforts.
Good morning, Chair. I want to first thank SALISES for inviting me to be part of the forum. I've been working on these issues on the financial sector for quite some time. I have a presentation here, but given that we have such a short timeline to present, I think I'm just going to focus on about 3 of those slides. So I had intended to talk a little bit about the international financial system and the impact of COVID in particular, but I'm going to just focus on the impact of the pandemic, some post-COVID trends in the international financial system, and of course, the policy strategy moving forward. Now, as you all would know, the pandemic threatened to derail international and domestic financial system. Initially, there was an uptick in volatility, but through unprecedented interventions at the global level, as well as important economies and the domestic economies, the central bank, the government, and the regulatory authorities were able to keep things largely in check. So basically, what could have happened was increased non-performing loans and the associated liquidity shortages, failure of financial institutions, and the related expensive government bailouts. Volatility in financial market, we saw some of that at the very beginning, but that tapered off very quickly. The disruption in the mobilization and allocation role of the financial sector, which is very, very important to growth, as you know, and of course, the potential fallout in areas such as economic growth, employment, inflation, and poverty. If you've been reading the international literature, you would know that at the global level, the international community have basically suffered a great deal in terms of the fact that poverty levels around the world has gone up significantly, right? That was one of the social development goal that we would have achieved, one of those benchmarks in 2015, but because of the pandemic, that particular metric is in need of some improvement. Of course, you would know as well that the domestic economy went into recession in 2020 due to the pandemic. It improved slightly in 2021, but is really fully expected to be bound in 2022 in line with the improvements in global economy. On the financial services sector side, profitability had suffered significantly. That was one area in the financial sector that had deteriorated significantly. But in 2021, profitability improved significantly as loan payment moratoriums were scaled back. And many people fear that there will be a serious uptick in non-performing loans, but in the Trinidad and Tobago case, actually, non-performing loans has not increased. Actually, it's the same level as 2020. So that is something that's favorable. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but for now, NPLs are relatively low and manageable. Very importantly as well, credit demand has started improving towards the 4th quarter of 2021, in particular business credit, which is an important metric, important marker for improvement in economic activity. Financial market volatility has not really been a problem, in large part because the government strategy of maintaining the exchange rate has backstopped that particular effort. Of course, the one worry that we have seen, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but elsewhere in the region and internationally, is the fact that inflation is now increasing significantly. And that is because of increases in commodity price, which helps us on one side. But other things such as supply bottlenecks, which have been intensified by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and increased freight charges have driven up inflation. As Lester indicated, that is going to complicate things in terms of monetary and fiscal policy because unions and so on are going to be demanding their pound of flesh. In terms of the entire domestic financial system, it weathered the global COVID-19 shock relatively well because of unprecedented interventions by regulators and governments. International financial institutions as well, such as the IMF, played their part, and as well private market participants, because of course the moratorium and loan payments that we saw in 2020, coming to an end towards the end of 2021, was actually put in place by private financial institutions, the banks in most cases, right? So every stakeholder in the economy basically played a part in trying to manage the situation, and we have been largely successful on that score. And as central banks and regulators have been doing stress tests of the financial services sector over time, and most of the stress tests that have come back indicate that the financial system is well able to withstand the shocks that we have simulated, largely because of strong capital and liquidity buffers. Very importantly, the COVID-19 pandemic actually happened in a period immediately after the international financial crisis in 2007-2008, and in Trinidad and Tobago here and in the Caribbean, the wholesale financial crisis. And because of those things, the financial architecture in the region and in Trinidad and Tobago have been fine-tuned, upgraded, and improved significantly. So when the COVID pandemic struck, we were actually in a very good place in terms of the institutional structure for regulation and supervision and so on to deal with those crises. So actually the earlier crisis in 2007, 2008 kind of prepared us to a large extent for what happened in 2020. Very importantly, Trinidad and Tobago, and as well as other Caribbean countries, have very strong capital and liquidity buffers, so that helped us. The industry in particular have benefited from improved risk management and so on, in keeping with international best practices and so on. We have, as I indicated, better regulatory and supervisory architecture in place, which has been ongoing, but which was accelerated in the aftermath of the international financial crisis and in the aftermath, in particular, of CL Financial, the CL Financial crisis. Very importantly, the liquidity crisis, which was precipitated in 2020 because of the pandemic, did not morph into a solvency crisis. If that had happened, then we may have seen the specter of financial institutions failing, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but around the region and so on. And of course, the unprecedented interventions I talked about, such as the moratorium and low payment, the changing of the way in which we classify the loan loss at a supervisory level, the interventions by the central bank in terms of lowering interest rates, the interventions by the government in terms of trying to provide transfers to individuals and institutions and firms to help them get over the hump and the problems related to COVID-19. All of those things would have helped. And these are things that we didn't see in the aftermath of the international financial crisis. So governments and regulators, by and large, recognize the unprecedented nature of the COVID-19 pandemic and acted accordingly. Very importantly as well, we have had a separate and more comprehensive regime for SIFIs, or systemically important financial institutions in the Caribbean. And that basically means that the big institutions are more closely regulated, because of course, the failure of one of those large institutions have more significant systemic consequences for Trinidad and Tobago and the region, and you want to focus most of your regulatory resources on those institutions. Very importantly as well, the close monitoring of financial interconnectedness and the potential contagion risk, because if you didn't know before 2009 and CL Financial that we are interconnected to a great degree in the Caribbean, and you cannot look at national financial stability without reference to the regional financial system and the international financial system as well. So that has been something that the central bank here in Trinidad and Tobago has been doing very closely in collaboration with their central bank colleagues throughout the Caribbean. And of course, very importantly, because this was an international shock, you needed international cooperation. And we have had a lot of help, not only from the IMF, but other regional international institutions that have provided advice, as well as financial resources to backstop some of our measures that the governments had instituted in 2020. In terms of some of the post-COVID trends, and people who are familiar with the financial services sector internationally would know some of these things. So some of these things have been ongoing for a long time. But what happened is that the international financial crisis, as well as the COVID pandemic, have accelerated these trends. In particular, the whole trend to increasing penetration of fintech was something that was ongoing for a very long time. But of course, it accelerated significantly in 2020 and the pandemic in the wake of the move to remote work and the focus of financial institutions in terms of leveraging their technological platforms to provide financial services and so on. So going forward, the most important point I think that we need to pay attention to is that the fact that fintech is going to have a primary role in what happens in the financial services sector, not only internationally, but in Trinidad and Tobago. We are going to have to deal, unfortunately, with very intrusive and comprehensive international financial rules and standards. And most people would be familiar with the AML CFT standards that we have to jump through. We are going to have to deal with an increasingly globalized, interconnected, consolidated and complex financial system. So that implies that the regulatory system has to improve in tandem with those kinds of trends. And of course, that's the fourth bullet. And of course, we are going to see increasingly concentrated capital flows. So countries are going to have to compete more intensively to get the required capital to backstop their investments and growth and so on. So those are some of the challenges that we would see moving forward. And in terms of the strategy, in relation to those trends and in relation to what has happened during the period of the pandemic, we are going to have to take action in a number of different areas. And one of them is because of the dominance of cities in the regional financial system, we have to ensure that our regulatory system in the region is backstopped by an appropriate architecture. And that means we need to have a kind of collaborative effort between regulators here in Trinidad and Tobago, in the rest of the region and internationally. And we are doing some of that because we now have regulatory colleges and so on for our largest financial institutions that have a regional footprint. Very importantly, because of accelerated fintech adoption, it has many benefits, but there are also potential risks. And of course, many people will be familiar with some of the cyber security incidents that have happened recently. And you need to have proper cybersecurity protocol to maintain information security, even more now because of the intensive use of these electronic platforms and so on. You very importantly have new and complex trade-off between financial stability, competition, and data protection, which means that the job of the regulator is going to become much more complicated. And very importantly, regulators and central banks needs to be on the cutting edge of technology, because increasingly, because of fintech, they have to leverage technology now to regulate those entities and so on. And many of our central banks have been spending a lot of money trying to get up to speed in this area. Very importantly, in Trinidad and Tobago, the government's decision to not use the exchange rate as the main tool to deal with our adjustment has helped us, because if we had a situation where the exchange rate was not as stable or fixed as it is, then that would have been meant that we had an additional level of difficulty to manage. And that is so because the exchange rate, as we know, has a whole set of psychological and behavioral economics aspects, which makes it very difficult for regulators to control. It would have damaged confidence in the TT-denominated financial assets because of substitution and so on. And that would have made the jobs of the regulator much more difficult. And of course, when you have speculation in the exchange rate side, it often generates perverse and overly risky investments, which makes the job of the regulator and the government much more difficult. And of course, because if you had that kind of financial instability, there will be growing demonetization of the formal financial system, which will make managing the Trinidad and Tobago economy that much more difficult. Of course, in this current...
If you can start wrapping up.
Yeah, there's three bullet points I have again, I'm done. So what you have to do is you have to enhance system as well for cross-border payments and remittances, and you have to deal in particular with the de-risking threat. I could answer some questions on what the de-risking threat is. You want to support financial inclusion. You want to ensure that there is a continual upgrading of the regulatory and supervisory system, because things are moving so quickly and so fast in that arena. And of course, improve international cooperation is critical, and we have some examples of that in terms of the Bank for International Settlements, the Innovation Hub, and the liquidity lines that is provided by the IMF. That has been critical for the region to get over the problems in terms of spending to backstop some of the efforts on the COVID-19 front. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Shridath, for that presentation, looking at the domestic and international financial market challenges, and also giving us some good news that the CLICO financial crisis actually prepared us to some extent, and highlighting the role of fintech, which takes us to our last presentation for today, done by Dr. Michelle Salandi, who will be looking at diversification of the financial sector, the fintech revolution. Dr. Salandi is a consultant and advocate for innovation and research through data analysis, and her research interest includes macroeconomic dynamics of developing countries in areas of capital flight, capital controls, income inequality, financial liberalization, regulatory policy, financial market development, and adoption of cashless and future-ready financial service technologies. Dr. Salandi, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to firstly start by saying thank you for inviting me to this seminar. Thus far, I think, I'm coming at last, but the presentations thus far have been really interesting. So I hope that I can keep up with the pace set. So I'd just like to share my presentation now. Again, I'm looking at the diversification of the financial sector in terms of the fintech evolution by really looking at what the financial services sector, in terms of the changes within that fintech space, can really bring to the development of Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean. And by starting with fintech, the first thing I want to do is just, get into what it really is. And fintech is really that portmanteau or blending of the words financial and technology. And what it has been done is really been credited to promoting modernization and digital transformation of the financial services sector, as it has really been allowed us to really remove demand and supply constraints within the financial sector, within the market. And it's really doing this evolution and this transformation by employing new technology tools. So as everyone says, now we're in this fourth industrial revolution, and the fourth industrial revolution tools of artificial intelligence, machine learning, distributed ledger technology, APIs, cloud computing, and even our smartphones are really being utilized to drive financial service innovation, enhance applications, processes, products, and business models within the financial services industry. So now that we have that, let's look at why do I believe, this can really change our financial system, diversify and transform. It's really because fintech has the potential to really subdivide the functions that are really offered by the current financial institutions. And for many, there's this transformation is occurring to what we call the 5 Ds, right? And the 5 Ds, one is democratization, as fintech has the ability now to bring traditional elements of finance, once only available to the wealthy and elite, to basically the masses. So it's really doing so by the ability to lower the cost and basically make it more attainable to the banked, the unbanked, and the underbanked within society. The other aspect of fintech is through disaggregation. And it's really this aggregation of financial services because it's really unbundling. So it's an unpackaged service. So this gives a broader product line where fintech firms are actually being specialized now in specific areas. And they're doing so. And it's already allowing customers to really assemble your own preferred suite. So if I just want lending, I want to do peer-to-peer transfers, then I'm able to do that with one company. The other aspect of fintech is through this intermediation. And by this intermediation, it's really this lens that's saying it's cutting out the middleman. And it's really cutting out the middleman by making settlement faster, cheaper, and near real-time settlement capabilities, because it may just simply be between yourself and someone through an app. And the fourthly is decentralization. In terms of fintech lexicon, we hear this in terms of, DeFi. And what DeFi really means is that now, again, new technology, consensus-based models through blockchain protocols, and smart contracts are reducing the need for oversight and governance requirements. So no longer you'll see financial institutions or companies say, well, I need to have a third party or someone else govern the procedure. Smart contracts, generally, they can occur as one option or one item is received, it moves on to the second stage automatically. So there's no need for oversight and all is stored on blockchain protocol. And lastly, one that is very key, especially for individuals that are outside of the market, is really debiasing, as fintech has been able to reduce asymmetric information. We talked about oil today in terms of that, but some may say data is the new oil. And by using data, we're able to remove historical bias and therefore improve greater transparency and equality for all customers. So I'll just quickly go through some of the things you hear when you think of evolution of the financial services. How is it changing? This exponential rate, this blurring of the lines between physical, digital, biological, it's really happening, and I'm going to discuss the financial sector and the financial industry, but it's happening in all industries. But within the financial sector, some core areas would be payments, capital raising services, insurance, investment management services. And now we hear terms like mobile wallets, digital currencies, crowdfunding, credit scoring, risk pricing. I mentioned smart contracts earlier on. And then lastly, we hear of things like robo-advisors and e-trading. Now, this is just a snippet of what is happening, because even within the fintech lexicon, that has actually been broken up now into fintech. You have lendtech, you have banktech, you have regtech. All right. So again, you realize that even within that fintech base, there are now going to be a lot of sub areas that are actually sometimes even being seen now in today as going to be taking on a life of their own. And this expands is really going to bring a wide and vast range of benefits. It's a revolutionary wave, and it's within financial sector development, but it has a very good push to bringing national development for many. And I'm just going to mention six reasons why. And 6 of them are basically increased access to financial services. So one of the core things that people generally have an issue with in terms of the financial sector is access. And what we're seeing is that with the move again to data and just having smaller companies who go into the financial space, they're really going to leverage their technology to basically target niche markets that weren't previously included within the financial space. And again, with credit scoring techniques, for instance, let's say you're going for a loan. What they have realized is that with credit scoring techniques and with the new algorithms, they have become 40% less likely to discriminate against minority borrowers. So again, greater access to credit means greater access for SME, for instance, and definitely greater length of investment and GDP long term. In terms of reducing the cost of financial services, again, microcredit, peer-to-peer lending, crowdfunding, making services a lot cheaper, a lot more accessible. In terms of robo-advisors, a segment in which was relatively very exclusive in terms of wealth management has also been lower cost, as robo-advisors are generally very cheaper than accessing a human in terms of wealth management services. We know that in today's world, we hear of things like reduced cash and the coin of cashless society. Cashless society is really about, getting that reduction in cash dependence. And the cash dependence has many benefits in terms of reduction in minutes and cost, that's one. But in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, what we saw is that since we needed to have lower touch points, we would not be able to physically meet in stores. Digital payments become very important. Being able to use QR codes, and that was utilized within Trinidad and Tobago. In terms of the borrowers in Trinidad and Tobago, some of them used it, the non-governmental organizations use it to actually bring credit or bring finance or some sort of relief to individuals in society quickly. This also reduces the risk of fraud, money laundering, and the speed in which citizens and individuals can access credit. Another is in terms of financial inclusion. Again, financial inclusion mentioned by Dr. Shridath, again, is one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And it's really there because with fintech, what has been seen is that it increases access by, again, the unbanked and the underbanked. As in Latin American and Caribbean economies, for instance, by a study done by IDB and Finovista, 46% of fintechs basically would have targeted solutions to underbanked consumers, bringing them on, bringing them within access, and definitely doing some major work there in terms of, even in the past, you look at Kenya, for example, with their mobile wallet and M-Pesa. So again, very noteworthy success with fintech companies. The other is in terms of improving ease of doing business, something that is very core to Trinidad and Tobago in terms of improving access and improving the way we can do things. And all of these, again, coming together to really look at how we can increase economic growth through digital payments, ease of accessing loans, etc., widening investment, widening credit potential, as well as creating an industry of its own, which is adding to the employment levels and the types of jobs and scope that, you know, young people and other citizens can get into. And as I end, and I'm going to wrap up here, we're just looking at the way forward. It's really, if fintech is really supposed to bring about this particular change within any economy, one of the things you want to look at is really how can I do this in a safe way? Because while fintech has many benefits, there can also, it means there's also need to really revise the legal and regulatory framework. So again, we may have to reduce the digital divide that exists so that more individuals will be able to access services online and know how to access services. There may be incentives that we can put forward to new and upcoming fintech companies, again, improve our digital skills and literacy, improve overall infrastructure alongside the regulatory and policy frameworks. And to ensure that I keep on time, I would just like to say thank you and end at this point.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for that presentation and keeping on time. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've had 6 very interesting presentations with their own unique perspective on the post-COVID-19 recovery. We started with a detailed look at the energy sector here in Trinidad and Tobago. We then looked at our trade policy in the wider Caribbean and developing a trade policy fit for the Caribbean. We also looked at fiscal issues in the post-COVID-19 recovery. We then looked at domestic and international financial market challenges, and then we ended with looking at diversification of financial markets through fintech. So the questions have been coming in, and I'm going to begin with first question from Lionel Remy. Now, he directed this question to Dr. James, but I think it's a good opening question, and anyone can jump in together with Dr. James. In the context of the economic models discussed, identify the psychosocial and cultural determinants that will facilitate successful implementation of the desired transformation.
Well, Mr. Remy, there are 2 angles that you want to focus on. One is technology is really a combination of knowledge, skills, self-confidence with other assets that people are using to produce anything. So knowledge and skills and self-confidence, especially self-confidence, is fundamentally what you're calling psychosocial. And you have to, as a society, be extremely careful not to exclude that side of the conversation. Deliberate training to improve self-confidence, for example, will be necessary if you want to make success in this area. The other thing is that participatory processes which allow the society to practice democracy, to practice control of policy, to practice control of the way the government, the executive, does business, is critical to the development of a society's capacity to engage the world and be self-confident in doing it. So those are the 2 angles I think you should pay close attention to when addressing the psychosocial issues. Priya is
Any of our panelists would like to add to what Dr. James would have said? If not, we can move on. Let's take two more questions from the audience. One from Okama Brook. What kinds of international trade policies can be recommended between SIDS and Africa? So probably this is directed at Alicia. Then we have Narisha Khan. I would like to get more detail on the Panton-Lyman Index and what variables it considers and relationships it predicts, probably for Dr. Henry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for the question. I did not catch the name, but thank you so much for the question with regard to Africa and Caribbean SIDS. And as we know, there has been a lot of movement going on there, certainly in terms of Barbados. There have been talks with regard to having air services agreements, which will help facilitate direct air connectivity between Barbados and one or two African countries. There's also direct chamber to chamber contact, which I know of for sure, where the two chambers, I don't know how much I could say because some of this is stuff that I would have worked on. And I don't have permission from my client to speak about this, but I do know that there have been discussions between the chambers and discussions with individual firms in order to build better relations. In addition to that, there's also been, I know there was a shipment of stuff here from Barbados to Ghana of Barbadian goods, sort of to whet the appetite of the Ghanaians for our products. And in addition to that, I think there would be need to look at the whole financial services industry as well, because I do know of situations where there have been, cases where clients have wanted to do work with Africa, but because of the banking situation, the bank transactions took a long time. So there's a lot to do on each of our ends, but I can say there's a lot of work going on. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Alicia. I just want to let the audience know that Alicia, thank you for your presentation. She has to leave now. You may probably contact her privately if you wish to continue the conversation. Dr. Henry, you may proceed on the Panton-Lyman Index.
Okay. Well, remember, it's a very informal index. It's not a scientific index, but it's quite an interesting concept in terms of looking at how people might be feeling about the economy, right? And in terms of what is happening recently, you can probably take some examples like the boom in visitors to Tobago over the Easter weekend as an indication of people exhaling from the 2 years of more or less lockdown, and also reports from restaurants and bars and so on, where you see a significant uptick despite the continuing presence of the COVID virus. People are still coming out. So it bodes very well, in terms of those retail businesses. So I think right now, definitely the Panton-Lyman Index is quite positive. At least we don't know how long it will last, but it's pretty good at the moment, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. We have two questions related to the financial sector. One from Kavish Kantan Singh. What impact can the introduction of a virtual integrated Caribbean regional dollar have on transitional timelines within sustainable development and harmonization of previous trade policies towards new policies taking into account the introduction of renewable energy among Central American and Caribbean SIDS? The next one from Jeremy Collymore. At the level of financial institutions, to what extent is the issue of organization resilience mainstream, Similarly, to what extent is foresight and embrace in the regional financial sector? I don't know who wants to go first, but Dr. Salandi, Dr. Shridath, Dr. Henry, any of our financial experts?
Okay, the one about from Jeremy about the organizational resilience and farsighted. The whole issue with fintech, as Dr. Salandi would most likely back me up on this. With fintech, and even before fintech, the whole issue of operational resilience was one of the major consideration that the risk management people at financial institutions will take account of. So with the onset of fintech covers, this has gone to a completely new level. So on the issue of organizational resilience and so on, that is well established in our financial institutions and it has been upgraded. You have to remember that some of our financial institutions are large regional and even international players. So they tend, their back office and their corporate governance framework and so on tend to be very, very sophisticated. In terms of farsighting as well, a lot of work has been done recently in terms of trying to determine where the Caribbean fit in terms of fitting into the international financial system and in terms of the potential competition from fintech, purely fintech organizations and so on. So I know a lot of the financial institutions have been thinking about these things and hired a lot of very expensive international consultants to help them foresight in these areas. So as I said before, some of our largest financial institutions are pretty sophisticated and they have been doing the same things that their counterparts in the developed world have been doing. So these things are being considered very actively by these institutions.
Yes, Dr. Shridath, I definitely would have to support you there in terms of fintech. And the foresight has been there, I would say, in terms of, and I'll just look at 3 areas, right? In terms of the private sector, I would say one of the things is that noticing that fintech is going to be a way to develop the country and to diversify in terms of how things can be done. There has been the development of what is considered to be a fintech association in Trinidad and Tobago, getting the information of fintech out there, getting more people involved and looking at ways in which, let's say if it's incentive programs or what is necessary to broaden the fintech integration. In terms of the regulators, there has been changes within the regulatory policy. So there was the e-money issuer order, which would have advanced the sector to allow e-money issuance in Trinidad and Tobago. And it allowed that in such a way as to also provide protection for individuals. So if you look at the e-money issuer order, it wasn't just decided to be carte blanche for everybody, but dependent on the type of e-money issuer license you wanted, they were segmented in terms of the value of somebody's mobile wallet, for instance. So again, it allowed for basically sort of a development of a low value payment system. So depending on if you were lower value, I know, if I recall, there was a difference between, I think it's a 500,000 in terms of initial registration, in terms of the money you have to keep, or 3% of the e-float, and for higher value, it was, I think, $1 million. So that's separated there. Again, I'm not sure if anybody realized, I know it was on draft, but the central bank had a draft payment system policy, which was out again, and that is really to advance and to protect and advance and regulate the financial sector by allowing more players to now come into the sector and be regulated. And so that's in the regulatory sector. And I think within the banking sector, there has also been that advancement or foresight, as a lot of the domestic players have actually, some of them are actually working with fintech companies. I know recently, well, I shouldn't say recently, but a couple of years ago, there was Republic Bank having a share in Novispas. I think it was 19.99%. And that allowed, as you would see today, you have more digital payment apps coming on and e-commerce apps. You have e-KYC platforms being leveraged. These are some of the advancements within the sector. And then we have more banks talking about possibly going digital. So that is one sector. And just to end off here, something of foresight within the Caribbean, we can see Caribbean central bank digital currencies being launched sometimes ahead of even first world countries around the world. So within the Caribbean, I know sometimes we are behind, but there are some areas in which we are leaps and bounds ahead, and we will, I think, seeing that there are developments happening, move forward in the future.
I think we also have to, it is all it's not only positive, but we have to be careful and wary of of potential pitfalls that could befall us. You know, most financial innovations, including fintech, is a kind of double-edged sword. It has many benefits, but you know, there are potential pitfalls that could befall countries who are not up to steam in terms of some of the risk and so on. And the fintech arena is no different. Some of the recent cyber incident we have had in the region should alert us to this fact. The problem that we face is that a lot of the financial institutions and a lot of the non-financial institutions who have leveraged the electronic platforms to sell their products and so on have not really paid a lot of attention to cybersecurity. So they have concentrated on building out their platforms to sell and to market and those kinds of things. But they have not spent a lot of money to backstop cybersecurity. And you have to remember, it have people out there whose job 24/7 is basically to be going over, reviewing different people's electronic platform to see whether there are backdoors or weaknesses that they could exploit and so on. And the problem with that is if you have weak cybersecurity and you are hacked, the reputational risk that will follow you afterwards, that increases, you know, that might have actually be one thing that could cause an entity to fail, a financial institution to fail. So if you want to participate in the big bad world and not spend money on to get the best cybersecurity there is out there, then you're going to have to pay a very high price. And on the digital currency side as well, this is actually a very active discussion among Caribbean central bank governors. And so as Michelle indicated, a lot of them are actually introducing central bank digital currency. The problem is that, you know, the main hump is, so you replace your paper currency with a digital currency. But in terms of trade and all the other things we talk about in terms of facilitating trade and financial services and so on, always comes back to the question, what is the common denominator you're going to be using? And even if you have a digital currency, you still have to, the individual jurisdictions will still require that you settle in US dollars, right? So it just makes a different form of the currency, which has certain advantages technologically and otherwise. But in terms of the major factor determining trade and financial services and other types of services, it really, you need to have some common denominator. And unless the region could come up with some kind of pool of resources where they settle their balances to each other using that fund, then it's going to be a difficulty. So I know this is an active discussion among central bankers, but don't think that the central bank digital currency is going to solve all your problems, you know, or Bitcoin is going to solve some of the issues we have with de-risking and so on. As a matter of fact, Prime Minister Rowley went to Washington recently to talk about this whole issue of de-risking, because if people understand de-risking, it is an existential threat to the Caribbean development trajectory and so on. And this is something that we need to pay attention to, and which is a byproduct of the international financial standards and rules that I mentioned earlier, which are being developed and we will increasingly have to adapt to, but in which we have no say in terms of how they are rolled out and so on. So that is a discussion I think that the region has to have with its international partners and so on.
I would just add to Dave's comments that in terms of the more recent developments, and one of the things that could possibly come out of it is an easing of the Americans' persistence on these standards and, you know, and threats of de-risking. as they see themselves fighting a bigger war rather than trying to spend time focusing on us. And I think that's one potential outcome, just as they have been approaching Maduro and so on, who they thought they will never talk to. They may backtrack on some of these issues. Hopefully, that's what I can see possibly happening. Not guaranteed, but it's a potential positive development that they will remove the emphasis on some of this stuff and focus on trying to build more positive relationships. And I think that's essentially the message of the Prime Minister when he was in Washington last week or week before. That it doesn't have to be such an adversarial relationship between the Caribbean, especially in the area of offshore finance and so on, which is for many Caribbean countries very critical to their diversification efforts. Okay.
Let me throw a caution in the wind there. As we get into the weeds of financial technology, it's important not to ignore that digitization generally, and fintech included, has a huge import bill associated with it. And the society needs to pay close attention to the need to come up with innovations of our own in order to do intra-industry trade, so that we can export appropriately our own innovations and finance a lot of the imports that are attached to tech, whether it's fintech or just general digital technology. Some care needs to be, some attention, specific attention needs to be given to that issue by national policymakers.
Okay, if we have no more comments, no more follow-up on these financial issues, I'll go on to a question directed at the energy sector from Dr. St. Bernard. So maybe Mr. Michael John can take this one. He begins with a comment. I remember being at a conference at the University of Havana back in 2018, hearing from the UAE ambassador to Cuba that the United Arab Emirates had a big party when they shipped their last shipment of oil. Basically, they declared that oil was history for the UAE and embarked on renewable energies and AI. Any thoughts on our national trust in similar directions, especially given the lifespan of oil and gas reserves and the pushback against fossil fuels? Mr. John, you'll have to unmute.
Yeah. First of all, as a country, we have been a bit more reluctant than our neighbors to go down the route of renewables and looking to prepare for life after oil. And one of the reasons generally advanced has been the cost of energy to the Trinidad and Tobago population. In that, for many years, we have not faced the economic costs of the energy we used. So when you're paying, what, 6 cents US per kilowatt hour for electricity, or the kind of prices we pay for fuel, there isn't the incentive to move. But there are moves in different areas with regards to looking at that. One area for near-term focus is the business of electricity generation. And well, there have been agreements with respect to solar generation for the grid. The challenge, though, is that we have not moved along the route of preparing the legislative framework that will be required for this transition. For example, to my knowledge, it is still illegal for you to generate electricity on your own, right? And until that is changed, then people will not be able to generate electricity and sell back to the grid. Now, the thing about it is the grid works one way in that we sell to the consumer. We're going to have to address the question of what I would call the deinstitutionalization of the energy, where we have to move away from all decentralized without the individual participation. There are moves really to go in the direction of life after oil, but it is not as fast as it could be. And the other thing about it is whenever there's a crisis and there's some relief in terms of revenues from oil, we tend to slow down on the moves away from oil. So that the current situation with Ukraine offers us an interesting opportunity, except that compared to past situations, we no longer are comfortable in terms of reserves and production, so that we can no longer ignore it if things last for a while. Dr. Henry spoke about the fiscal benefit, and that is true. But at the same time, there is the expectation that comes from the population that moves them away from moving away from oil when there is relief and when the government gets additional revenue. Expectations rise, like we see now with labor negotiations, but we really need to be moving to reduce our dependence on oil, because there will come a time when we will not have the reserves and production to benefit from it. So over to you, Dr. Mohan.
Okay.
Can I weigh in on that a little bit, Priya?
Sure, yes.
I remember back in 1997 when the THA took a proposal to the central government to use Tobago as a pilot program to begin the move away from oil and gas as the basis of our energy generation and shift to solar and wind and wave and exploit the potential around Tobago. And the government said that there is no need for that in the foreseeable future. So we shouldn't be bothered too much. Gas and oil will always be cheaper than energy generated by wind and wave and solar. Well, we now know that that was the wrong interpretation, and we also should learn from that, that a substantial change in the disposition of the population in Trinidad will be needed if we're going to have to make a substantial shift. Because I think the people who are wedded to dependent psychologically on oil and gas for everything, including energy, money, and so on, really the people in Trinidad. There's currently on the table the proposal coming forward from Tobago again, including proposals discussed with TNTech, to let's get busy generating a large share of the energy used in Tobago with surpluses to be exported back to Trinidad through solar and wind and so on. So we're ready here in Tobago. It would be up to you in Trinidad to get ready and get the movement going in the right direction that John is talking about.
And I just wanted to add to what Dr. James is saying, that a lot of the work will have to do with people's minds, because you see the kind of reaction that is happening now with regards to removal of subsidies. People are saying, remove the subsidies, but not in my area, right? Let it be other people. And the truth is, if we have to move forward, then the subsidies will have to go, unpleasant as it is.
Okay, we have two other questions here. One from Wayne Calendar. We have not heard anything about the role of the cooperative sector in poverty alleviation, nor in reducing the food import bill. And we have one from Haiti Tania. How ready is Trinidad and Tobago in terms of skill sets for the green trusts in different areas? These are open to anyone who would like to go.
Well, may I say that readiness is a state of mind. We are always able to get started with any of these agendas if we are willing to confront the reality that change is needed. We just get started. We democratize the country. We put in place a chief innovation officer to get innovation underway, get the public participating in the process. We change the way we think of production and the structure of production and so on. And we are always ready as a people to get started on that kind of agenda, especially if we took the steps and we're willing to take the steps to democratize decision-making. So there's no psychological barrier as such. There are structural, institutional barriers, and we can tackle them at any time.
On the agricultural front, I think people may know that there is actually a conference, agricultural conference in Guyana, which have pretty high participation from heads of state that's going on. So I think people are realizing now, given the experience of COVID and the problems with international supply chain for food and so on, that some level of food security is going to have to be planned for in the future. And in the context of our small land sizes, Guyana and Suriname probably is going to have to be central to that approach. And we have to adopt a more regional approach to dealing with some of our vulnerabilities and so on. I remember Lester saying in a previous discussion many moons ago that, food security is national security. And the Europeans know this because they went through 2 world wars. And they know if you can't, if you could block off your food supplies, then you are in a very, very vulnerable position. So I think the policymakers are now coming around to the fact that, you can't eat oil. You can't eat the tourism product. You need to have some minimum level of food security. And because of the small land sizes of our various economies and so on, even in Trinidad and Tobago, we are small. People don't realize that. They think we are big in the Caribbean, but we are a very, very small country. And we have to leverage the resources we have in the region, in Guyana and in Suriname, to backstop some of that resilience by producing a lot of our own food. And it has implications on the foreign exchange front. If you keep the money in the region, then you could utilize it for more innovative things like movement and transition into more green forms of electricity and so on and so forth. So a lot of these things, we really have to do it in collaboration. And we have to get out of the mindset of being in Tobago, being in Trinidad, or being in Jamaica, if we want to achieve some of those things. Working in a region for all these many years and so on, people don't realize we are much more similar than we are different. But people tend to focus on how different we are, right? And if we want to move forward, we definitely have to leverage the scarce resources we have, both in terms of land and in terms of capital and intellectual resources as well, because we do have an exhaustive supply of intellectual resources and expertise in various areas to backstop all of these things that we are talking about.
Yeah, I would just like to add on, just as my 2 other colleagues had sounded a note of caution. I'm not a big fan of fossil fuels, but I do believe that they're going to be with us for some time to come, despite the promises of green and alternative energies. I mean, it's very unlikely that we will have a proper transition to alternative energy sources anytime in the next 20 or 30 years. I mean, it's going to take a long time for that to happen on a global scale, much less in our less developed alternative realities here in terms of what we have to face. And so I think it's going to be a while, and it's not going to be easy, because there are recent developments that are showing tremendous problems with wind energy and so on. And Germany was going in that direction. They abolished their nuclear power plants and so on, and now they're kind of regretting it. So on that score, it's not always going to be roses going forward with alternative energy. And electric cars and so on hold out a bit of promise, but remember, electricity is not a source of power, right? Electricity has to be generated from something. What is going to generate the electricity to drive those cars, those electric cars and so on that Musk and people like that are trying to sell all over the world? And so there has to be a power source. And with the increasing convergence to some extent of developing and developed countries in terms of their energy demands, more cars, more refrigerators, more microwaves, whatever, that demand electricity. It is not feasible that we're going to be out of this fossil fuel, oil, gas type of arrangement. And I think what is going on in Europe right now and related developments with China and India, what India is stockpiling Russian oil and so on for a reason. They know that they will need it for a long time to come, even if they don't need it today. And China is also increasing their stockpiles of oil. They say they're getting it cheap from Russia now, so they're buying more. And they will not, so I'm saying it's not like anything on the near horizon that we would be able to weed ourselves off fossil fuels. And even in Trinidad and Tobago, I think it would take at least 20 to 30 years, minimum.
Permit me to jump in with Dr. Henry here. For me, the challenge, Dr. Henry, is that sure, oil and gas may be around, but I'm not so sure what will our experience be, because, for example, we can find ourselves with oil and gas around, but having to import it, right? As we do now with petroleum products. And so that we have moved away from the level of energy security we used to have when you say had a refining industry. So it means now that you have to be more careful, because one of the impacts of, let's say, the closure of the refinery would have been a foreign exchange impact to facilitate other things. So that if we have moved from having a situation where we earn it to a situation where we have to use foreign exchange to pay for it, we still have to be very cautious as to how we go and what we do. Right? I certainly accept that oil doesn't go away, right? It has been around, and there has been resurgence of oil demand whenever there's crisis. And if we look back through the history, we could see that. But my concern, as I underscored, was that oil may be around, but we may not have it.
And you may not have the climate in which to enjoy your oil, because the climate doesn't give you the 20, 30 years that Lester is talking about. It is heating up. India and Pakistan just went through this massive challenge. The Americans are facing it with heat waves in the West. And the whole global climate. I was just watching a documentary a couple of days ago in which Africa is hottest and heating up even more. We're not going to have the climate to have the viewpoint to facilitate the viewpoint that we will have oil and gas with us forevermore. What we have to think about is like a vaccine. You have the disease, you have the climate change challenges coming down on you, and you have to find a way to think through and solve this problem of how you get out of the fundamental cause, which are these fossil fuels. I think that's the perspective that we have to adopt, and whatever time it takes us, with whatever resources we can put into the research, let's get there and do so. And I don't think Caribbean people should encourage any viewpoint that it is there with us, so to say. So live with it. I think we will suffer very much with our loss of economic opportunity. Or beaches here in Tobago, we are facing enormous challenges already with threats to our economic base in the beaches and so on. So climate is not waiting on you. You're going to have to find a way to deal with this problem. And that means in the end, removing the threat that the fossil fuels pose to the climate as a whole.
Yes, as I said, I wasn't an advocate of the fossil fuel industry or anything like that. I was just trying to add the other side to the perspective. That I have never been against any of the initiatives that Vanessa has brought forward in terms of renewable energy. Of course, it makes sense. My point is that it is not that easy to do. You know, it's just very difficult. It's just like all forms of like diversification of an economy. It's you know, you could talk about it till the sun burns out. It's just not an easy thing to do. That's my reality check then on it. Even though I'm not against the movement away from fossil fuels.
I want to recognize Dr. St. Bernard's hand is up if he wants to say something.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to respond to the issue of food security. And yes, it is a very important issue. And perhaps, you know, we should have entertained panelists who can speak comfortably to that in this session. But as you would be aware, these sessions, we cannot really cover everything. And it's interesting to know that just this week, you know, I have been discussing with a colleague from CADI the possibility of collaborating with CADI and actually hosting a particular forum looking specifically at the whole question of food security. Because if you want to speak about an issue that is truly interdisciplinary, food security is it, because it doesn't matter whether you're talking about education, health, livelihoods, climate change, what have you. Food security is a big issue, and I think it is something that we have to entertain in our discussions, in our forums as we go into the future. So the member in the audience who actually raised the question about food security, rest assured that sometime in the future, we will emphasize the importance of having a discussion around that particular issue. And of course, your concerns will surely be addressed. I just wanted to say that in passing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. St. Bernard. We need to begin wrapping up. We do have a comment and a question in the chat. The comment being that technical revolution towards renewable energy sources and innovations may not have yet been released towards developing countries due to structural sociological development models to accommodate implementation or educational upgrading of skills to accommodate new technologies within intellectual property standards currently present in SIDS policies. So it's just a comment as to what would have been said before. And there's a final question, an issue we did not touch on, similar to the food security, that I just want to flag. It's the issue of unsustainable waste disposal systems, such as burning of garbage in landfills, and concerns around this as we look at proper disposal of waste and recycling. I don't know if anybody wants to speak to it, because it wasn't a particular topic of anyone, but I just wanted to raise the issue.
That issue can fall under the energy discussion, because it is possible, and people have been doing it, to convert waste to energy, so that the use of waste to energy systems allow you to manage your waste, especially in countries like ours where land is not a luxury, right? So yes, and that is part of the renewable energy discussion in the sense, or the alternative energy discussion, in the sense that methane from landfills and waste to energy, or utilizing waste, burning it for controlled burning, that is, for the generation of electricity. All those are options that can be examined when you're looking at the alternative energy set of options.
Thank you. I have one final question as a chair, really quick, and you can give a very brief answer. I've just tied in the financial with the energy sector and the renewable. Do you all see financial innovations, financing mechanisms, international climate finance, instruments for reducing greenhouse gases, and transitioning to renewable energy, climate change and adaptation and mitigation strategies, and disaster management in the Caribbean?
Well, on the development financing front, when you're talking, I was yesterday, as a matter of fact, I was supposed to be in an ICLA conference today talking about innovative sources of finance. And one of the points that was made is that, you know, there's increasingly money devoted in the development financing arena to these renewable sources of energy and so on. So, you know, there's a lot of more money being put into these areas, especially if you look at the development financing landscape with some of these charitable foundations like the Bill Gates Foundation and so on, that is focused on the environment and green technologies and so on. You know, and in the context of the shortage of development finance and generally for developing countries, you know, if you want to leverage more development financing, there are a lot of opportunities in that arena for development finance. And the corollary, you know, if you talk about the big energy companies, they are scaling back significantly investment, especially in jurisdictions like Trinidad and Tobago, where they may not be able to get as much bang for their buck, so to speak. So moving forward, although we may have these energy resources in the ground, if we're not big enough or cheap enough to get it out of the ground, then we will not see FDI coming our way in terms of the financing of fossil fuel type investments and so on. So on both fronts, in terms of the financing arena, you know, we have to be thinking ahead of the game in terms of transitioning, right? And you know, British BP is now is beyond petroleum, not British Petroleum anymore, right? So is beyond petroleum. So even the energy giants are transitioning away, and part of that process is less investment in energy, particularly in smaller jurisdictions like ours, right? So you know, these guys are looking at Guyana now, and the point might be, you know what, you know, that might be a better destination for my investment than Trinidad and Tobago. So there are pull and push factors, and we may actually, even if we want to stay in energy for a longer period, you know, the rug might be pulled out from under us, and we have to have a plan B.
Let me see if I can throw a light on this innovation side of the innovative financing. One aspect of that, of course, is always new ways to raise money, where you're going to get the money from. But a big aspect of it, and maybe the one that the Caribbean region should focus on, is what you're going to do with the money, new things you're going to do with the money. What we've seen across the region over the last 60 years is that a lot of what is called development banking and development financing has focused on very mundane things, financing agriculture and what used to be called industrialization and so on. What we now know much better is that the primary focus on which we should be putting our attention is on the production of capital, education, healthcare, the things we can produce that would be used to make things, because that is what will drive the transformation of the structure of the economy. So if that's a major element in the innovative financing, it will yield the fruits that we want. If it is not a major element, and we're just talking about new ways to raise money and give people access to money, then another 60 years will pass and we won't have generated the development effects that we're looking for. So I think we need to bring the capital production side, the financing of capital production, as Arthur Lewis identified way back in 1954. We need to bring that side more clearly into focus when we're talking about innovative financing.
Thank you. Okay, so we need to really begin to wrap up. I want to thank everyone, but I'm going to hand you over to Miss Alicia Shepherd, who's going to give the official vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, maybe for some persons. Yes, the discussion was definitely invigorating. Thank you, Chair, for handing the session over to me at this point in time. So as we come to the close of another SALISES virtual forum, post-COVID recovery and economic imperatives for growth and sustainable development in Trinidad and Tobago, I've been asked to extend our gratitude to those of you who labored in the vineyard to serve us up, though in some respects hard to swallow, this timely feast. We start by thanking first Dr. St. Bernard for particularly his foresight in bringing us together and for his knack in choosing the right panelists for the job. To our panelists, we say a hearty thank you for your invaluable, thought-provoking, and insightful contributions. Mr. John, he highlighted the paradigm that in Trinidad, there's this paradigm we're stuck in time, and that Trinidad and Tobago's resistance to change has to change. He reminded us that the role of gas and oil has to change in alignment with global goals. Thank you, Mr. John. Ms. Nicholls, she underscored that Caribbean small boat economies are traveling through rough and unpredicted global waters. With our open, dependent economies, we require all hands on deck and no more small pegs in round holes. Thank you, Ms. Nicholls. I think she might have left the room. Dr. Henry, he informed us that Trinidad and Tobago economy has thus far benefited fiscally from the conflict in Europe and the US-Venezuela standoff. He cautioned, however, that it would be prudent to monitor these closely, as well as the ongoing labor relations in the country, the Pantin-Lyman Index, as well as the pending fallout from increased government borrowings. Thank you, Dr. Henry. Dr. James, he made a point that the diversification and the systematic improvement of the Tobagonian economy is a must, as it is now living above its means if it's going to catch up with the sister island, the rest of the world. These improvements are much needed. Thank you, Dr. James. Dr. Shridath, he informed us that the pandemic brought reversals of global and national goals and accelerated the decline of several ratings in the country and globally, of course. He warmed our hearts, however, by reminding us of the fact that the economy was cushioned during this period of the pandemic, ironically, by the regulations and protocols put in place after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Thank you, Dr. Shridath. Dr. Salandi, in her synopsis of the fintech services, indicated that fintech offer developing countries like Trinidad and Tobago several benefits: democratization, disaggregation, disintermediation, decentralization, debiasing of the financial sector. But she cautioned that in order to benefit from fintech services, we would require several initiatives, including reducing the digital divide, improving infrastructure, and human capital development. Thank you, The panelists, you were awesome. I've learned so much. The discussion was riveting. I didn't want it to stop. But before I go, I must also thank our support staff, the chair. Chair, we want to thank you so much for a job well done. Dr. Mohammed, you have skillfully and seamlessly weaved together the discourse. Mohan, sorry. Sorry. You have skillfully weaved together the discussions and discourse and the segments. We want to thank you for that. And to the rest of the SALISES support staff, Kathy Ann, Francine, Ephraim, Sheldon, Sita, thank you, thank you. I know from personal experience that you are the backbone of the operation. We just want to thank you guys. To the UE marketing and communication team, thanks for your patience, guidance, and attention to detail. It's wonderful. Last but certainly not least, thanks to the audience for coming and staying, and very importantly, for your intriguing questions. They certainly invigorated the conversation and in some instances uprooted entirely new perspectives and issues. Thank you, thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our SALISES virtual forum, Post-COVID Recovery and Economic Imperatives for Growth and Sustainable Development in Trinidad and Tobago. I am Priya Mohan, and it has been my pleasure to be your chair for this event. On behalf of SALISES, we would like to thank you for being with us and do look forward to seeing you at our future events. I would just like to ask our director, Dr. St. Bernard, if he has any final words before we go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Priya. And in the interest of time, I will do my best to be as short as possible. I must say that, again, this particular session that we had today did deliver and come true to form. We have been doing very well with our virtual SALISES forums thus far, and today's session has been no different in that regard. I know that we started with panelists who focus specifically on a number of disparate issues, but I can tell, and I am sure everyone who witnessed today's proceedings can say that the interdisciplinary nature of the forum did become manifest at the time when the discussion began to unfold. And certainly, I think, it was a clever mix of each of the presentations and how they mixed and combined to inform the discussion, engaging the panelists in the discussion in response to the questions posed by the virtual audience. So altogether, I think we had a splendid day today, and I am sure it was a worthy treat for all who witnessed what went on. All I need to say now is that, SALISES, quite apart from these virtual forums, we do have what we term the Spotlight series that features our academics who present bits of their work in a scholarly format, in a scholarly forum, so to speak. And we have already had Dr. Priya Mohan, who spoke to natural disasters and climate shocks, building economic resilience in Caribbean SIDS. She spoke to that a few weeks ago, and it was an awesome presentation that gained tremendous traction. I can assure you that on the next Friday, we will be having the second installment of our Spotlight series, in which Dr. Indira Ramphal, another fellow here in SALISES, will be speaking to the issue of the Caribbean Court of Justice and regional integration. And as we proceed over the next few months, you will hear about other fellows making presentations in keeping with the research that they do. So I want again to echo the sentiments of the chairperson and our colleague who delivered the vote of thanks. I want to echo the sentiments of thanks to all who made today's session the success it was. And please do look forward to other SALISES events that we hope to pose in in the near future. So thank you all for your tremendous support and your contributions to the success of today's proceedings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a safe afternoon and a great weekend.